Loneliness isn't what people think it is. It's not just being alone. It's being surrounded by people and still feeling like you're fading out of the room. It's the space between the voice you use for the world and the one that trembles inside your head. It's that quiet moment after laughter dies and you realize you don't belong anywhere. Not fully. Not completely. But Carl Jung saw loneliness differently. He believed loneliness was not a tragedy, but a stage of transformation. The place where the false self starts to die and the real one begins to breathe. He wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." And in that single line, he revealed something most people never understand. Loneliness isn't the absence of company. It's the absence of connection. We think we want people, but what we really want is to be understood, to speak and feel that someone else truly hears it, not with their ears, but with their soul. And when that never happens, we retreat. We begin to live in our heads, surrounded by noise, but untouched by meaning. This is where loneliness becomes dangerous, because when the world stops reflecting you, your mind starts building its own mirrors, fantasy, imagination, even pain. You start creating stories that help you survive. Stories like, "I'm better off alone," or "No one can handle me," or the cruelest one of all, "Maybe I was never meant to be understood." You begin to build an identity out of isolation, because at least that identity doesn't leave you. But Jung would say, this isn't failure. It's awakening. When you withdraw from the world, it's not because you hate people. It's because the soul can't keep pretending anymore. It's tired of conversations that never touch the truth. It's exhausted from being half alive in places where your full self is too much. So the mind begins its rebellion. It isolates you, not as punishment, but as protection. The people you lose during this time aren't losses. They're the noise being filtered out so you can hear your own voice again. It's like a spiritual quarantine, painful, quiet, but necessary. Loneliness, Jung said, is the price of consciousness. When you begin to see yourself clearly, the crowd starts to fade. Because awakening separates you from everything that once distracted you from who you are. The first stage of loneliness feels like collapse. The identity you wore for years begins to crack. You look around, and the people who used to feel familiar suddenly don't. You start realizing that much of your life was built to avoid this very silence. You filled it with plans, conversations, and noise. Anything to stay busy enough not to feel the void underneath. But now, the noise doesn't work anymore. Now, the silence wins. And in that silence, something terrifying happens. You start to hear yourself. Not the polite version, not the social one, but the raw, wordless voice that's been buried since childhood, the one that remembers what it felt like to be ignored or unseen or misunderstood. You realize this loneliness isn't new. It's ancient. It's been following you since the day you learned to perform just to be loved. And now that performance has stopped. The loneliness you avoided finally steps forward. It doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. It just stands there, quietly, asking one question. Who are you when no one is watching? That's what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming whole. It's not glamorous. It's not peaceful. It's lonely. Because you're leaving the familiar world behind. The ego fights it. The ego says, you need people. You need attention. You need something to fill this emptiness. But the soul answers, no, I need to remember myself. So you stop reaching out as much. You stop explaining yourself. You start craving solitude, not as escape, but as clarity. Because for the first time, being alone feels cleaner than being misunderstood. Loneliness becomes less like a wound and more like a classroom. It teaches you what kind of company drains you. It shows you which parts of you were never truly yours, and it reveals how much of your personality was built to please people who never stayed. Slowly, the silence stops feeling empty. It starts feeling sacred, because in it, you realize something extraordinary. You were never actually alone. You were just never present with yourself. All those years of chasing connection, validation, distraction, they were all ways of running away from the one relationship you were born to have, the one with your own soul. And when you finally sit still long enough, the loneliness starts to shift. The sadness turns into observation. The ache turns into awareness. The emptiness becomes a mirror, showing you every part of yourself you tried to hide. You start seeing the patterns, how much energy you gave just to be chosen, how much silence you endured just to be accepted, how much truth you swallowed just to belong. And once you see that, you can't go back. You can't unsee the truth of who you are when no one else is around. That's why Jung said, loneliness is for the brave, because it takes courage to face the self without distraction. It takes courage to admit how long you've been living as someone else. And it takes even more courage to stay in that silence until it starts to heal you. But it will. Because every stage of loneliness is a bridge, from illusion to truth, from imitation to authenticity. And when you finally walk that bridge, you realize you were never searching for people. You were searching for peace. And it was here, all along, waiting in the quiet, patient as ever, whispering the truth that will change everything. You were never broken. You were just unheard. At first, loneliness feels like silence. But if you stay in it long enough, it starts speaking back. And what it says often hurts. It tells you how much of your life was built around noise, people, messages, distractions, anything to avoid meeting yourself. It shows you the mask you wear when you smile at strangers. It whispers the truth you've been postponing for years. You don't really know who you are without someone else to react to. That's the shock of real loneliness. It doesn't just remove others. It removes the version of you that existed for them. Carl Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And that's what loneliness demands. Acceptance without audience. Because when there's no one to perform for, no one to impress, and no one to please, what's left is you. At first, it feels unbearable. So you start building armor. You tell yourself you're fine alone. You say you prefer peace. You convince yourself that isolation is strength. And sometimes it is. But sometimes it's not peace. It's protection. Protection from vulnerability, rejection, and the fear of being seen. That's what psychologists call emotional armor, a defense mechanism built from years of disappointment. It's the invisible wall between you and the world, made from every moment you reached out and got silence in return. So instead of being hurt again, you hide. You shrink into solitude, but dress it up as self-control. You say, "I don't need anyone." And soon you start believing it. But deep inside, you still crave connection. You just no longer trust it. This is the paradox of the lonely mind. It wants warmth, but fears fire. It longs for understanding, but rejects exposure. It dreams of being seen, but hides behind walls so thick that even love can't get through. Jung called this shadow isolation. It's when your unconscious convinces you that solitude is safer than surrender, that it's better to be alone in control than together and vulnerable. It's a lie that feels like truth, because it's built from experience. You've seen what happens when you open up. You've watched people turn your honesty into discomfort. You've been told you're too much, too quiet, too deep. So now you show less and less until the world stops asking who you really are. But here's what Jung understood. When the world stops seeing you, the psyche turns inward. It becomes its own mirror, its own teacher, its own witness. That's when solitude transforms into something sacred. Loneliness is the first stage. Solitude is what happens when you stop running from it. In loneliness, you mourn what's gone. In solitude, you discover what remains. They feel similar, but they're worlds apart. Loneliness hurts because you're still hoping for rescue. Solitude heals because you stop waiting to be found. And that's when your inner life begins to bloom. The same silence that once felt unbearable becomes the sound of peace. You start enjoying your own company, not out of defiance, but appreciation. You realize that the space you used to fill with others can be filled with meaning. Reading, creating, thinking, simply existing without needing proof that it matters. This is what Jung meant when he said, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." The lonely turn inward and awaken. they learn that the only way out of emptiness is through it, that pain can be a path, and silence can be a teacher. You begin to see how loneliness was never punishment. It was preparation. It was life clearing the noise so you could meet the person you were supposed to become. It's in that stillness that you meet your shadow, the parts of you that were exiled long ago. The version of you that was too emotional, too needy, too sensitive. And you realize something shocking. Those weren't weaknesses. They were simply parts of you that never got love, so you start giving them love yourself. You sit with your sadness instead of rushing it away. You hold your own hand through the night. You start showing up for yourself the way you once begged others to. And slowly, loneliness turns into self-connection. The armor softens. You begin letting life back in, not because you need it, but because you now have room for it. And here's the most beautiful thing. When you stop fearing solitude, you attract connection that's real, because you no longer beg for it. You no longer cling to people who drain you. You no longer confuse attention with love. You start attracting others who've made peace with their own silence, people who aren't looking to escape themselves, but to share presence. That's the foundation of true intimacy. Two souls who've learned to be alone, meeting without trying to fix each other. Jung believed that every person must go through the dark night of isolation before they can love authentically. Because only when you've faced yourself can you meet someone else without projection. Loneliness burns away illusion. It destroys your dependence on noise. It strips you down until all that's left is truth. And that truth, though painful, is freedom. You learn that you don't have to fill silence with conversation. You don't have to chase people who can't hear you. You don't have to keep shrinking just to stay close. Because the more you honor your solitude, the more life begins to mirror it back. Peace finds you in small ways: the morning light, the sound of rain, the quiet realization that you are no longer running. And maybe that's the true purpose of loneliness. Not to punish you for being different, but to show you who you were before the world told you who to be. You stop waiting for someone to understand your silence. You start speaking with your soul instead. And in that sacred language, loneliness transforms into belonging, not to others, but to yourself. Because at the end of every lonely night, there's one truth waiting patiently for you to notice. You were never missing people. You were missing yourself. There comes a point when loneliness stops being something that happens to you and starts becoming something that happens for you. You stop asking, "Why did everyone leave?" and start wondering, what part of me needed the silence to hear myself again? That's the turning point Jung called the awakening within solitude, when the mind stops seeking noise to feel alive and begins to find life inside stillness. It's not a sudden change. It's gradual, like dawn, light creeping in so slowly that you don't notice it until everything around you glows differently. You begin to see that every lonely night, every unanswered message, every quiet room was never proof of your unworthiness. It was initiation, the universe's way of pulling you away from imitation and back into authenticity. Jung often wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But to do that, you must first walk through the loneliness of being misunderstood. Because the moment you stop conforming to the collective, when you stop living through the expectations of others, the world no longer recognizes you. And that gap between who you were and who you're becoming is what we call loneliness. It's the space between masks, the in-between where the old self has died and the new self hasn't been born yet. That's why this kind of loneliness feels spiritual, because it is. It's not about missing people. It's about mourning your old self, the version of you that chased approval, that performed to belong, that confused noise for connection. That self served its purpose. It kept you safe in a world that didn't understand you. But now it's gone, and the silence that remains is the sound of rebirth. You start to notice small things again. The way the wind sounds different when you're not rushing somewhere. The way your thoughts slow down when you're not trying to impress anyone. The way your body feels lighter when it no longer needs to be validated. And for the first time, you meet the person beneath the performance. They're quieter, softer, maybe even uncertain. But they're real. That's what Jung meant by individuation, becoming whole, not by adding more, but by shedding everything false. The process is lonely, because truth always begins in silence. The noise has to fall away for the self to be heard. You begin to realize that loneliness was never emptiness. It was cleansing, a detox of every false connection, every shallow conversation, every relationship built on survival instead of sincerity. And once that cleansing happens, something subtle shifts inside you. The need to be liked fades. The urge to be everywhere disappears. The hunger to be desired weakens. You start craving depth instead of attention, peace instead of excitement, solitude instead of approval. That's when the loneliness that used to suffocate you begins to feed you, because it's no longer isolation. It's intimacy with yourself. You start spending time alone and realizing you're not lonely. You're home. The silence that once frightened you now feels familiar. It's like returning to a childhood place you forgot existed, a private garden that always belonged to you, but was overgrown by years of noise. Jung described this moment as the soul's return to center. It's when you stop orbiting around others and start revolving around your own truth. When life stops being about proving yourself and starts being about expressing yourself. And something remarkable happens after that. The right kind of people begin to appear. Not because you chased them, not because you became more impressive, but because you're finally real. When you stop performing, your energy becomes honest. And honest energy attracts those who've done the same. They're not drawn to your appearance or your charm. They're drawn to your peace. That's the irony Jung spoke of. You spend years trying to belong to the world, and the moment you stop trying, you finally find your people. Because loneliness purifies the kind of connection you allow. It makes you allergic to shallow love and allergic to fake closeness. You stop trying to fill space with anyone who fits. You wait for what feels right, even if it takes time. And in that waiting, you build something most people never do. A relationship with yourself that doesn't depend on constant reassurance. That's the gift hidden inside loneliness. Self-sufficiency without coldness. Strength without arrogance. Independence without bitterness. You start realizing that you can love others without losing yourself. You can care deeply without collapsing. You can be present without pretending. And when that happens, connection returns, not as a need, but as a choice. You no longer chase love. You become love. Not the romantic kind, the state of being where your presence feels like calm, where you no longer demand from others what you've already given to yourself. That's when you understand why Jung saw loneliness as sacred, because it's the crucible where your soul learns wholeness. Most people fear being alone because they've never stayed long enough to find what's inside it. But those who endure it, those who listen to it, come out different, calmer, deeper, unshakable. They no longer need attention to feel real. They no longer panic when plans fall through. They no longer shrink in rooms where they don't belong. Because they've learned that belonging isn't about fitting in. It's about being at peace wherever you are. You begin to see loneliness not as a wound, but as wisdom. Because it taught you everything noise never could. It taught you that presence is stronger than company. That silence speaks louder than words. That solitude, when embraced, doesn't separate you from the world. It connects you to it differently. It connects you not through craving, but through compassion. You start noticing others who carry the same quiet, people who've been broken but rebuilt, who speak softly but mean everything. You see yourself in them, and for the first time, that reflection doesn't hurt. It feels like home. That's the evolution of loneliness. It starts as isolation. It becomes reflection. And it ends as connection. Not with everyone, but with everything. You stop asking, "Why me?" and start saying, "Thank you," because you realize loneliness didn't destroy you. It revealed you. It stripped you of what was never real and left you with what can never be taken, your own presence. That's the quiet victory no one talks about. You outgrow the need to escape your mind. You stop begging for belonging. You start walking through the world as if every moment, every breath, every silence belongs to you. And in that calm, in that peace that once felt impossible, you finally understand the truth Jung hinted at all along. You were never alone. You were just learning how to return. You were never meant to be surrounded. You were meant to be found by yourself. Because the loudest rooms can still feel empty, and the quietest nights can teach you who you really are. If this video stayed with you longer than words, don't rush to fill the silence. Sit in it. Let it hold you. Like this video, if it spoke your truth. Comment what loneliness has taught you, and subscribe to Psychatic, where solitude stops being pain and starts becoming peace. Because sometimes it's not the world that leaves you alone. It's life giving you back to yourself.